Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our study of Genesis chapter 31. Sometimes one of the hardest things that there is to do is discern the will of God in your life, whatever situation you're in. Now, there's going to be times when it's easy and it's obvious, and there's going to be times when you just don't know what to do. But there is something that we can be looking and listening for while trying to discern what to do. Warren Wiersbe once said, God leads people through the inner witness of the heart, the outer circumstances in life, and the truth in the Word. Now, many years ago, I was a foolish teenager and I'd left home on a Greyhound bus and ended up on the East Coast. Now, I'd had a place of my own and a steady job, but being teenagers, I thought I had a bright idea and I ran away from it all. It didn't take me very long to realize the mistake that I had made. Looking back from my perspective today, I can see where God used those three things to bring me back home. There was the inner witness of my heart. After coming home for Christmas, I realized just how homesick I'd become. Seeing my parents, my childhood home, the place where I used to work, it just made my stomach twist into knots. Then there was the outward circumstances in my life. Shortly after I'd went back after Christmas, one of my best friends from school had passed away back here in Oklahoma. I realized I was missing my friends. My dad was working the hayfields all alone, and the longing to come back home was even more intense. And then there was the truth of His Word. One of the first times in my life that I picked up a Bible is when I lived on the East Coast. I was confused, so I'd randomly just started in Deuteronomy. Of all places for a person to start in the Bible for the first time, Deuteronomy. I'd asked some of my coworkers there about a passage I was having trouble with, and he laughed at me and was stunned that I was actually reading a Bible. Well, I wasn't a Christian yet, but I knew that my grandparents back home would have been able to answer my questions, and most of the folks that I'd worked with in Oklahoma, they wouldn't laugh at my curiosity of the Scripture. So I came back home, and within a couple of years, the Lord got a hold of me. Now, in our study in Genesis, we see Jacob going through these same three things. In the previous chapter, he had the inner desire to return home. Joseph had just been born, making 11 sons and one daughter. And maybe it was the sense of completion after Rachel had finally bore a son, but he was homesick and he didn't realize it. Or maybe God's beginning to draw Jacob back to where he belonged. And I think it could have been all of the above. Yet old Laban wasn't about to have it. He was determined to keep Jacob and to keep that family under his thumb, mostly because he's getting rich off of the back of his young son-in-law. So with the inner longing of his heart already set on going home for the past 6 years, God will now use the outside circumstances and His Word to steer Jacob out of Haran and back to Canaan. His 20-year career as Laban's shepherd's boy was about to end, and we read of this and we wonder, why didn't he go sooner? But for some people, when they've been in a situation for a really long time, they begin to fear change. This is the life that Jacob had known for 2 decades. This is the only life that his wives and his children had ever known. And if there's any uncertainty back home, how much had things changed there? Had they changed at all? Would he be welcomed back? Would he be pursued by his maniacal brother Esau? Since this is a lengthy chapter, we won't be able to cover the entire journey and the big chase scene. He doesn't make a clean getaway, but what we will see is what it finally took for him to realize and understand what God's will for his life was. You can't trust just the desire of your heart alone. The heart of man is deceitful and wicked, but if what you are yearning for is God's will, He will steer you that way when the timing is right, but not until then. In Genesis 31, let's begin with the first 4 verses. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father he has made all this wealth. Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly towards him as formerly. Then the Lord said to Jacob, Return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field. In a world with no machinery, no vehicle traffic, and the hustle and bustle of life not being there, it's a lot easier to hear everything around you. The only noise was the occasional bleat of livestock, so voices would carry well, just like if you're ever at a lake. We've already seen where Rebekah had overheard Isaac planning to bless Esau instead of Jacob, and it was also overheard how Esau wanted to kill Jacob, and now he happened to overhear the grumbling of Laban's sons. It must have been very hard to keep a secret back then. According to the research I mentioned in the previous lesson, Laban had 3 sons. Beor is the only one that's mentioned by name when he snitches on Jacob for running away. But here in verse 1, it confirms more than one child by the plural use of the word sons. Now, according to Jewish writings, the 3 sons were Beor, Alub, and Merash. Also, their mother was named Adonah, but their names were not as important to the narrative of the Bible passage as Leah and Rachel, so they are not named here. Now, these sons must have been just as shady as their father. I mean, they're already complicit in Laban's wage-changing scheme. When the agreement was made that all the speckled, spotted, and striped animals were to be Jacob's wages, Laban immediately tipped the scales in his favor by removing those animals that already fit that description so that they wouldn't breed in the herd that Jacob was watching for him. And the text told us that Laban had his sons take these and keep them. We can safely assume that these boys must have not been really handy with animals. I mean, they weren't keeping the flocks in the first place, and now they get stuck tending the animals that don't have a very high value. And they were there mostly just to keep the odds in their dad's favor by keeping these animals away from the rest. But God is with Jacob, and through divine providence and recessive genetics, Laban's solid-colored animals start popping out speckled, striped, and spotted babies. These babies grow up and they rapidly reproduce, growing in far greater number than the solid-colored ones that belong to Laban. On top of that, the healthiest of the herds and the flocks were the spotted ones belonging to Jacob. The weakest animals made up Laban's portion. These boys had to have been spying on Jacob to know this. Laban had put a distance of 3 days' journey between the flocks. Had they stayed where they were supposed to be, they would have continued being content with their lot in life. Once they saw what Jacob had going on, they grew envious. And envy is a very serious sin. There's a reason why "thou shalt not covet" made God's top 10 list. There is nothing wrong with admiring something that someone else has. The problem begins when you stop being content with what you have and you think that other person shouldn't have whatever it is. And technically, with the split herds and the flocks that Jacob is tending starting to grow kind of lopsided in numbers and strength, they think that he is cheating their dad out of his wealth. They said, from what belonged to our father, he has made up all of his wealth. I think the real reason these boys were so concerned was not their father's financial well-being. This was their inheritance that Jacob is messing with in their eyes. Never mind that they are supposed to be tending a flock of speckled animals that really belongs to Jacob in order to be fair. That was the original agreement. They were accomplices in their dad's cheating scheme, so it's only right that they should receive consequences as well. According to verse 2, it says, Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and things weren't so well with his father-in-law anymore. So these boys must have reported what they saw to their dad, or maybe Laban noticed when he went over that way and checked on his critters. He must have been astounded when he saw the great numbers of these multicolored animals out there when he had deliberately removed all of those from the breeding stock. And I wonder if he went over and tried to scrub some of these spots off. Maybe Jacob used a dye of some kind. Either way, Laban was no longer being cordial. When he was making money and when he was blessed because of Jacob, he loved him. But that's just proof that monetary gain was the only reason that he loved Jacob. If greed wasn't a factor and if he would open his eyes, Laban would realize that his sons are petty and worthless. Now, Laban is no spring chicken himself. He isn't going to live forever. These animals that were being born didn't just belong to Jacob, who was working hard for him for over 20 years now. They also belong to his 2 daughters and to his 12 grandchildren. Laban should be happy that God is blessing them. He was on the receiving end of the blessing for 14 years, despite his wicked behavior, and now at least the next generation of his family is being blessed. But that wasn't anywhere near the mind of Laban. I don't think he had a heart. He had a calculator and a financial ledger in his chest cavity instead. So far, we have seen the inner longing of Jacob's heart desiring to return home, and now we have seen the second thing, the significant outward circumstances pushing him to make that move. And then in verse 3 comes the final thing of those 3 needed to make the choice. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Return to the land of your fathers." I like how he wised up there in verse 4. Jacob is not taking any chances of his plans getting leaked or somebody eavesdropping on the conversation. He calls Leah and Rachel out into the fields where nobody else is around. Only the animals heard what he had to say. Heard. I didn't mean that to be a pun. He had to run this by his wives first. Ever since the fall of man in the garden, the husband has been charged with leading the family. But a wise husband will also include his wife in the decision-making process. And I admire Jacob for that. He is about to ask these women to move away from all that they have ever known, to take their children away from their grandfather, who apparently loves money more than them anyway. But before making a drastic decision that affects the entire family, he informs them of what's going on. And we'll go ahead and pick up in verses 5 through 9. And he said to them, "I see your father's attitude, that it is not friendly towards me as formerly, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. However, God did not allow him to hurt me. If he spoke thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all of the flock brought forth speckled. If he spoke thus, the striped shall be your wages, then all of the flock brought forth striped. Thus God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me." He begins his speech by pointing out the obvious. Their dad doesn't like him very much anymore. Now, there are many couples out there that have struggles with their in-laws, and it is so common that there's hundreds of jokes going around about in-law relationships. Now, I have been blessed with in-laws that are good people, and they seem to tolerate me, so all is well. But here is a case where in-laws can make things difficult for some people who don't have the blessing of a loving relationship with their spouse's family. I have to remind myself of this and keep myself in check when my grown children began dating. And dads, fathers, you need to remember that the potential spouse of your child doesn't need to fit your needs. It needs to fit theirs. You might have had different ideas about who your children should marry than they do, but you're not the one spending the rest of your life with that person. They are. I began to look at the only qualifications that really matter. As long as they are good to my grown kids and treat them well and be true to them, we're good. Take care of them. Be there for them. Don't crush their dreams. Protect them with your life should the situation arise. And so far, my children are making decent choices in that department, so I'm not going to complain. But Laban has no reason to get angry with Jacob other than just simple greed. Jacob never retaliated over being deceived and getting stuck with Leah. He performed his duty as a husband, and Leah now has many sons and a daughter, enough to make any Israelite woman happy. Yes, Leah was unloved because she felt unloved because Jacob loved Rachel more, but Jacob has always loved Rachel more. He did not ask for Leah, but he did what he could do for her. We never read of her lacking anything else, and she didn't ask for this either. Laban deserved all of the ill will for her heartache, not Jacob. Jacob worked really hard. He cared for his family, and he was true to them. But they drug him into some dysfunctional things that never should have happened, but he did his best to be the husband and the father that the family needed. And he reminded them of that in verse 6. He served them with all of his strength. He had done nothing wrong. What did Laban really have on him? What could Laban possibly say about him? And he had peeled some bark off some sticks and he put them beside the sheep and goats when he watered them. Does he really think that Jacob and that silly act had anything to do with the number of animals being born with odd colorings? And then in verses 7 through 9, he pleads his case with his wives about the treachery that their father has committed against them. And they know that he's telling the truth. Leah was dragged into this marriage where she's going to spend her whole life as a third wheel. Rachel has had to share everything with her sister for her whole life. Now, even her husband. They saw the extra 7 years that Jacob had to work for them both. And they've more than likely witnessed all of these attempts of their dad to cheat him out of these animals that Jacob was supposedly working for. It began with Laban removing the ones from the flock that are supposed to be the starting capital. In verse 7, Jacob explains that Laban has changed his wages 10 times. The thing with Leah was one. The removal with the animals was another, but apparently there were more times that we weren't told about, and he finally airs them out here out of his desperation. Laban apparently kept changing the deal, narrowing it down to simply stripes, or simply spots, or the speckled. Independently, all of these things, changing Jacob's wages, and then all of the colored ones altogether. In verse 7, Jacob also said something that stands out. However, God did not allow him to harm me. Now, at first, it sounds like there might have been a physical attack on Jacob at some point, or even a threat, and God protected him. But to me, it sounds more like he is referring to financial harm. Despite Laban's attempts to undermine Jacob's growing success, God still provided for him. Let's move on and get verses 10 through 13. And it came about at that time when the flock were mating that I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats which were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in a dream, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. He said, Lift up now your eyes and see that all the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. As Jacob continues to plead his case and his innocence to his two wives, he sheds a little light on something that we were confused about in the previous chapter. Remember that whole weird thing with all those different colored rods peeled back and placed before the sheep? At first glance, a person would just chalk this up to superstitious nonsense. There is absolutely nothing that Jacob did that influenced the appearance of this offspring. God did all of that. Jacob might have had a hand in being selective about when the weaker and the stronger ones were breeding, giving himself a little bit of advantage on the health and the stature of the animals, but God gave the increase, and God determined which ones would be born with the appearance which would decide who owns them. Jacob finally reveals that all of this was shown to him in a dream. So maybe the scene with those weird rods and stuff was not actually an attempt to use superstition to help God out. Perhaps he might have been instructed to do this as a sign. We don't know. But we do know that God told him what the results would be. Many times in the Bible, when the God gave a message directly to a prophet, they were told to use an illustration as kind of making the point. And it was always something strange that captured the attention of those who were watching. Like Ezekiel, he had to lay on his left side for 390 days to symbolize the punishment of the house of Israel, then lay on his right side for 40 days for the punishment of Judah. God commanded Ezekiel to bake and eat food cooked over human excrement, signifying the uncleanness of the food that the Israelites would eat when they're in exile. Thankfully, he pleaded with God, and God let him use cow poop instead. Much better, Ezekiel shaved his head and his beard, dividing the hair into three parts to represent the fate of the people. Then there's Jeremiah walking through town wearing a yoke to symbolize the servitude of the nation. Hosea was told to marry a prostitute and have children with strange names like not loved and not my people. And then when she went back to her old ways, he had to go out and buy back his wife, representing how God would purchase the nation back, despite them being unfaithful. In Isaiah chapter 20, Isaiah had to go around town naked and barefoot to make a point. Jeremiah had to hide his underwear under a rock and then go back and get them after a long time in chapter 13 of his book. So it may very well be possible that this weird behavior of Jacob in the previous chapter might have been a sign of the promise that God was going to make all of these multicolored animals thrive and increase. And one more thing before we move on. I think this vision might have been what they call a Christophany. I don't think this was an ordinary angel visiting Jacob, but it was none other than a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, just like in the fiery furnace with Daniel's friend. Because first of all, in verse 11, it says, "The angel of the Lord said to me." Now, some translations, like the Holman Christian Standard Bible, have the word angel capitalized there. This title is sometimes used in the Old Testament appearances of Christ. But secondly, in verse 13, who did this angel say that he was? He said, "I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar." There is only one who can claim to be God and be truthful. None other than Jesus. And in that verse, Jacob received reassurance that God would be with him and that he needed to go home to his family. And I think Jacob needed that reassurance then more than ever. Yes, he's been wanting to go home for quite some time now, but would home still be there? Would his folks still be alive? Would his brothers still want him dead? Despite all of his desire to return to Canaan, there was the fear of the unknown. But right then, God put those fears to rest. Let's go ahead and get verses 14 through 16. Rachel and Leah said to him, "Do we still have any portion or inheritance with our father's house? Are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. Surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you." Much to Jacob's delight, his family was on board with his decision to move everybody away from there. Now, I know that there are many times when it may be difficult for a wife to submit to her husband's leadership of the family. If what he is proposing to do is sinful or evil, then object. But most other times, you got to let him make the call, as God called him to do. And if what the husband chooses is foolish or a mistake, he is going to be the one that's going to be accountable to God for that decision. But here, both of the daughters of Laban agreed it's in everybody's best interest to pack up and move away from their father. I am concerned that the first factor in their decision-making process was financial. In verse 14, they said, "Do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house?" They realized that there's nothing there left for them. As a father, I would have to say Laban's biggest loss was not the number of his herds or his flocks, but losing the respect and the hearts of his daughters. That's his biggest loss. He has failed as a parent. Money was Laban's family to him. In verse 15, they put it plainly, he has sold us, and he's entirely consumed our purchase price. They felt that all they were to their father was an object that he could profit off of or barter away for goods, and they were right. Laban may have gotten an extra 7 years of free labor out of Jacob, but it was at the expense of subjecting his oldest daughter to a lifetime of loveless marriage. Not because Jacob was being mean, but because she was not the one that he had loved and worked 7 years for. And thanks to their dad, they now have a very dysfunctional family that is full of squabbling. Also, their father consumed everything that there was anyway. The 14 years of his labor for his daughters was over. Laban conned Jacob into staying another 6 years because he'd been blessed financially while Jacob's working there. But now that blessing has been taken away because of the greed and the wrongful dealings that he had done unto Jacob. Laban didn't have much when Jacob first got there. Under Jacob's care and under God's blessings, he was prosperous. And now Laban is right back where he started, if not worse off than before. All of his wealth and prosperity had technically not vanished. It was just rightly transferred to the one that had earned it many, many times over. And these girls recognized that truth. They said in verse 16, "Surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children." They're on board with their husband's plans to move away. They knew that they would fare better, even in an unknown land, with their godly husband rather than their deceptive father. Let's go on into verses 17 through 21. Then Jacob arose and put his children and his wives upon camels, and he drove away all his livestock and all his property which he had gathered, his acquired livestock which he had gathered in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan, his father Isaac. When Laban had gone to shear his flock, then Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he was fleeing. So he fled with all that he had, and he arose and crossed the Euphrates River and set his face towards the hill country of Gilead. Jacob wasn't going to waste any time. He began his exit strategy the moment that they agreed to get on board. Immediately, he puts everyone on camels. Had they stayed there any longer, their plans would be leaked or somebody would catch on. Maybe Laban or the other brothers would notice that loose ends are being tied up, and they would notice an increase in coldness and distance because Jacob has already been sensitive to this. Jacob figured that the best way to do this is just up and leave without a notice. Now, of course, Laban's going to voice his disapproval at this later. He doesn't get a chance to say goodbye to his daughters and his grandchildren, and that's really understandable. And this could be considered a lack of faith and an act of cowardice. This would make him look like he's afraid of conflict and doesn't think God would protect him. And that's also true because God had guaranteed him that he was going to be brought home safely. But consider who we are dealing with here. Years ago, when Laban made money from his sister getting married to the guy's father, Laban tried to delay the servant of Abraham. They tried to get him to stay another 10 days. They claimed they wanted to have a farewell party for Rebekah, to give her a chance to say goodbye to all the friends and all the neighbors. But knowing what we know now, those 10 days would have turned into 10 years. Laban would change the deal over and over again to keep stalling and to make more money in gifts. Laban has already kept Jacob way too long. He was supposed to work for 7 years, marry Rachel, go home. It has now been 20 years. Jacob doesn't know it yet, but back home, his mother has passed away. Things have changed, and he has missed a lot thanks to Laban's schemes. Saying goodbye to Laban is really only going to result in more delays. Some of the grandkids are going to start whining about missing their papa, who would actually sell them in a heartbeat given the opportunity. So I can fully understand Jacob's rush to avoid the small talk, avoid the goodbyes, and just disappear. Instead of giving his boss a 2 weeks notice, he was giving him 2 weeks to notice that he was gone. Jacob may have been labeled as deceiving Laban by doing this, but Jacob was still honest about dividing the property truthfully. He didn't take Laban's dwindling herd from him. It said in verse 18, he drove away all his livestock and his property which he gathered, his acquired livestock. Jacob had wisely made the deal to make sure his livestock had a distinct appearance from Laban's, so when they do catch him down the road, nobody could accuse him of stealing. Even though Jacob was not guilty of stealing, it appears that not everybody had the same convictions he did. In verse 19, look what the loved wife did. Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. Now, this is why I'm beginning to think that Leah was a far better wife than Rachel. When Leah began bearing children, Rachel yelled at Jacob for not giving her kids too, as if he had control over that. What concerns me most about this stunt that she pulls is not the fact that she is a thief. I mean, don't get me wrong there, that does concern me, but not as much as what she stole. Idols. A useless chunk of wood or stone or metal. It just sits there. All throughout the Old Testament, we see not only Israel, but all of the nations having these useless idols. Aaron and Jeroboam, both of them made golden calves. Both of them claimed that it wasn't God that delivered them from Egypt. It was those statues that are just sitting there. Never mind that when they left Egypt, the gold and the material that those calves were made out of were still necklaces and earrings, maybe a gold tooth standing out from the rotten ones in some old-timer's mouth. I can never understand how they can place their faith in an idol. I am so thankful, and you should be too, that we have a God that cannot be stolen. Many years later, the Philistines would invade Israel, and they would steal the Ark of the Covenant, and they thought that golden box was Israel's source of strength. Well, that box wasn't the God of Israel. God is. The Philistines took the ark and placed it inside the temple of their idol called Dagon. Now, really quickly, I want to show you how silly their little statue was that they worshipped and how powerful our God is. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, verses 2 through 4, then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. When the Ashdodites rose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and set him in his place again. When they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. They had placed all of their faith and all of their trust in this carved statue named Dagon. But God knocked it over, and he even made an inanimate object bow down to him. Well, bow down to the ark anyway, but you get the symbolism. The next time it happens, old Dagon, he's laying on the Dagon floor in pieces. Their so-called God is over there yelling, "I've fallen and I can't get up." That event was followed by an outbreak of painful tumors, and they realized, hey, we better return this ark. They weren't smart enough to realize that their broken statue was not really a god at all, but they knew that the power of the God of Israel was very real. So Jacob packs up all that he owns, and unknown to him, there is also a stolen idol in their midst, hiding inside Rachel's belongings. Verse 19 says, Jacob deceived. Verse 20 says, Rachel stole. We never hear of Leah doing anything like that, but that's another discussion for another time. Meanwhile, Jacob is just focused on getting his massive family and his enormous herds and flocks as far away as he can before Laban finds out that he's missing. He wants to put as much distance as possible between himself and Laban. The difference is, when Laban pursues him, he won't be traveling with slow-moving livestock that need to rest and eat and be watered and probably run astray from time to time and have to go chase him down. Laban won't have wives that need to pull over and use the restroom every 5 miles. He won't have to threaten his kids by yelling, "Don't make me turn these camels around." Running from this conflict will be impossible. It may be considered a lack of faith on Jacob's part to leave secretly, but as we'll see next time, he will still have to depend on God.